What up, sugar lumps? All right, so let's get on to some more ecology. All right, so I put my favorite animal up in the world on the slide, just because it's really sad that what is actually happening to them. All right, so we're going to look at the effects of global warming on the environment. So we're specifically going to looking at global warming, and eventually later we'll focus on a little bit more on climate change in South Africa specifically. All right, so ecology, unfortunately, is much like the taxes in the world. So I will be specifically teaching you about South Africa, even though a lot of the topics are very worldwide and worldwide spread. Okay, so we all know that this is very incorrect, and that polar bears don't in fact eat penguins because they're on different poles of the earth. But it's fun to imagine polar bears chasing around these little birds that like run around and can't fly. It'll be exciting. Okay, cool, let's go. So let's look at the observed, measured changes in the climate. So we're going to look at temperature, precipitation. What is precipitation? There are different kinds of them. So we're going to be looking at snow, sleet, rain, all those other wonderful bits and pieces, but mainly just rain. Okay, but those are all different kinds of precipitation. We have sea levels that are changing, melting of ice, seasonal changes, and then specifically in terms of precipitation, because remember, please go back if you haven't watched the video on how erosion occurs. But with increased precipitation and lack of different plants and stuff in the area, we're then going to experience huge amounts of desertification, and prevent how we're going to look at how we can prevent desertification. So desertification, not dessert as in like the stuff you eat after dinner when you're still hungry and you feel like something sweet. We're talking about the creation of a desert. Okay, and please note that desert is spelled with one S and desert is two S's. Desert. Okay, this is desert. Okay, so let's look at temperature. So the surface temperature has increased by about 0.8 degrees Celsius from about 1901 to 2010. Now, please, this sounds like nothing, but if your internal temperature of your body increased from 37 to 37.8 degrees Celsius, you would be experiencing a fever, okay? And if you're experiencing a fever, it means that you're sick. So is the earth probably sick? I'm being so ridiculous right now. But I mean, the temperature is increasing. The problem is that there are a lot of animals that live in the world that need a very stable temperature to survive in, and if their temperature starts increasing and or decreasing for that matter, they actually might not survive at all within their environment. Okay, and then of that 0.8 degrees Celsius, 0.5 from 1979 to 2010. Okay, I don't have the 2020 numbers. I'll probably include that if you want it. I'll input on the group. But you can see that we are rapidly increasing, and there's not much we can do about it because we're stupid like that. And even though we've tried to incorporate a whole bunch of protocols, there was a Kyoto Protocol, which was one of the most famous in the world, and that was supposed to be signed by all the countries in the world, and some of the biggest names in the world like China didn't sign it, even though they're part of the EU, and it's a whole big palaver. Okay, so the warmest 10 years have occurred since 1997 to about 2011, where in Kauai it reached temperatures of 53.5 degrees Celsius. You could almost cook a chicken in that for a while. Okay, it would cook for a very long time, but you could cook an egg as well. All right, so 53.5 degrees Celsius is extremely warm, and it really, really, really is going to, be quite rough. And that's hot. I mean, and you must remember that all the countries that live on the equator are also going to be a lot warmer than the ones on the poles. All right, so then let's look at precipitation. The amount of heavy rain events have increased in the last 50 years, and that's extremely true, and you've noticed that as well. Even though it seems like, oh my gosh, we're going through a drought, areas where there are rain, there is going to be a substantial amount of more rain, okay? And this is because increased temperatures cause an increase in condensation. Increase in condensation causes increased cloud formation, more clouds, more condensation, more precipitation or rain or hail or sleet or snow, and that is going to cause some serious problems such as flash floods, severe storms, and droughts to a large extent, because even if the water is condensing, it's moving away somewhere else, and then that's not causing rainfall to occur, which can cause some serious problems. All right, so periods of drought followed by flash floods, washing away the topsoil. And what is topsoil? That is a layer of nutrients that are on top of your normal sandy soil, and that is where plants are actually able to get a lot of their nutrients from to develop. So if we wash that away, no plants can develop. So soil is unable to support plant life, leading to the formation of deserts, and this is a process called desertification. Alrighty. So it's just about supporting plant life, and if we can't do that, remember I said to you that the roots are able to hold onto the soil. So if we can't hold onto the soil, that means that all that is going to be washed away, and if it's washed away, we're going to end up with a desert. Okay, and then the soil is going to be called what we know as infertile. So if it has a very good topsoil, it is fertile soil. If it has a bad topsoil or no topsoil, it is known as infertile soil, which just means nothing can develop. All right, so let's look at the effects of desertification. Desertification, I don't know how you feel like pronouncing it. The loss of plants leads to soil erosion, floods, and dust storms. Okay, we spoke about that with the mine dumps earlier or in the previous lesson. Lack of plants lead to decrease in animal biodiversity because animals rely on plants to eat. And if they can't eat, then they will die. And then if those herbivores die, that means that the carnivores who eat them can't live either. And the omnivores who eat both plants and animals can't live either. So everyone's just going to die, all right, if we create a desert. And when you're about to say now, oh, but there are things that live in the desert, and that's because they're extremely adapted to live in those environments. If the middle of Cape Town all of a sudden had to become a desert, or the middle of the Kruger National Park had to become a desert, how many of those would be able to adapt to their new environment and actually become, or be able to survive in a desert? So loss of biodiversity equals loss of many food chains. Remember, this is also going to lead to humans not getting their food. So this is also going to lead to a sense of food insecurity, and finally often leads to poverty. So how do we prevent this? We should plant trees and bushes to help bind the soil and act as a windbreak. We spoke about this previous lesson. And reduce the number of grazing animals, because if I'm going to put something like goats and or cows into an environment where there's lots of grasses and stuff which hold the soil together, and they eat all of those grasses away, there's nothing that is going to be able to hold the soil actually together. And if you can't hold the soil together, we're going to end up in desertification. So you need to reduce the number of grazing animals. And when you're about to say, oh, but then what happens to the Kruger National Park? They actually kill off, or they increase the amount of predators. And I'll teach you about the predator-prey graphs next year, as to how we can regulate the amount of grazing animals in the environment. Finally, we can implement irrigation schemes, because if I keep on introducing water, eventually that's just going to wash away all the soil. So what I need to do is only water in very specific times and ensure that the plants are growing so that there's no desertification and or erosion. This is some hands clapping for whoever feels like it for the day. All right, sea levels. The global sea levels have increased by 17 centimeters. That's more than half a ruler over the last 100 years. Do you know how much that is? That is a substantial amount of water. The entire oceans to increase by 17 centimeters. That's madness. All right, sea levels increase because of the water expansions, because of an increase in ocean temperature. Remember that warmer water, the molecules are actually further apart from each other, so they require more space, which means that the entire level is just going to increase. The sea level is also increasing because of melting ice sheets from Greenland and Antarctica. Interesting. Do you know the difference between what the Antarctica is and the Arctic? Okay, go and Google that. I might ask you in your quiz for next week. Okay, so the sea level is also increasing because of melting ice sheets, and this is also going to lead to a loss of biodiversity, as we were seeing with the polar bears. All right, so let's look at seasonal changes. This is quite a sad story as well. We're going to have earlier springs, and that means that it's going to be warmer for longer. Now remember that certain plants and certain seeds require cold to actually kick them out of something called a dormancy. So seeds, the reason why they don't develop in a packet is not because they are not in soil, it's because they're not in their correct environments, like the right temperature, the right amount of light, the right amount of water, right amount of temperature, okay? So all of those things are very specific, and if we have earlier springs, it might mean that a lot of those plants that are developing they need to develop because of cold, just won't, because they won't get enough time to actually be cold, and because of the earlier springs. We're going to have longer frost-free periods, and this is also a problem. As sad as it sounds, a lot of plants need to die, and we can't always rely on fire to actually burn these out. So a lot of the cold causes plants to die, which reduces the amount of competition that is for very specific plants to develop and grow during winter seasons so that they can actually survive. Longer growing seasons. Sure, this is great for agriculture, but agriculture is human beings actually going and ripping apart a whole bunch of natural environments just so that we can plant mealies and beans and peas and all those other bits and pieces so that we can eat. I mean, it's not natural. On top of it, we're including a whole bunch of animals that graze all that natural indigenous and endemic species as well, which is causing a loss of biodiversity and a loss of food, and it's just one big hoo-ha. But longer growing seasons is not a good thing. Oh, my computer just completely froze. All right, shifts in migratory patterns of birds, because remember that they only migrate because of the cold weather. So if I'm not going to get the cold weather, I'm not going to migrate, and I'm not going to migrate, it might affect my reproductive patterns, like certain animals actually reproduce in certain areas so that their babies can be in a very specific environment, and then when the migration happens again, they can pick up their babies and go all the way back. Okay, so it's not like birds are the best parents on earth, but I mean, to a large extent they do kind of help in a large extent. All right, let's look at predicted changes or predicted consequences of climate change in South Africa specifically. All right, so the warming, we're going to increase by like 1 or 2 degrees Celsius. They estimate by the year 2050, which is also just an estimation, that the temperature would have increased by about 5 degrees Celsius. We're going to see extreme weather patterns. So this extreme weather is like flash floods, crazy storms, not necessarily tsunamis. Remember, that's not like a weather thing. That's more of like the earth shaking and like water being thrown all over the place. Extreme droughts is another thing with extreme weather. So it's either too much water, too little water, too much heat, too little heat. Sorry, I pushed the wrong button there. Rainfall and water availability. So this is extremely important, and I like asking this in tests, and I like throwing it into a paper too specifically. Rainfall and water availability. So the western part of the country becomes drier, where the eastern parts of the country become wetter. Why? Because the eastern parts are surrounded by a warmer current than the western parts, okay? And even though there's an increase in temperature, a lot of the movement of the wind is going to cause, because we have this huge draft from the western side of the country to the eastern side of the country, so a lot of that water is going to end up near like Durban and KZN and Mpumalanga and those kinds of places, so it's going to affect it quite rapidly. Then we're going to have biodiversity, changes in biodiversity of succulent and karoo, fynbos and grasslands. Remember that the succulent, karoo, and all those that survive in those semi-arid areas will then start to encroach on other areas because it gets warmer and they can survive in the warmer areas, whereas plants that cannot survive in the warmer areas will just die out. So you'll almost have this sort of homogenization, or this like one specific kind of plant will take over the whole of South Africa because of the change in environment. Okay, we'll also lose our fynbos completely, and that will lead to a loss in ecotourism. It will lead to a loss in biodiversity. It will lead to a loss of just general tourism, not necessarily ecotourism, but people just know that the fynbos is there, and even if they drive past it, they're happy just to see it over there. Farming and food security. Maize and cereal production is affected. It will get too hot, and maize won't grow. And then finally, health concerns regarding malaria. Remember that malaria, or the Anopheles mosquito, only develop in extremely warm and moist environments. So if when South Africa does have a lot of moisture, so we are going to have this increased temperature, which means that those mosquitoes are going to move down south. And when they move down south, with the increased rain that we're going to have in certain parts of the country, we're then going to suffer from a lot of malaria, okay, and we're going to struggle quite. Finally, this is just to look at the direct emissions of what's going on and how this is directly affecting our atmosphere as well. We have direct emissions and we have indirect emissions. I'm not too phased at all of these. You can read through this by yourself, but it's just to note like where these certain greenhouse gases are actually coming from, which links to the previous lesson, and which ones actually produce the most. So you've got your septic tanks, which is where you store all of your poop. We've got your vehicles, which are producing methane as well as carbon dioxide and water, and all of those, we expressed how dangerous they actually are in the environment. Okay, so that is a relatively quick lesson compared to the rest, and I hope you guys have an absolutely fantastic day. We'll be continuing with the rest of air in the next episode. Have a good luck weekend. Bye.